Summer 1944, Normandy. The nightmare landscape of the bocage, that ancient maze of sunken lanes, impenetrable hedgerows and tiny fields, had become the perfect hunting ground for the German sniper. Hidden deep within the dense foliage, often perched high in centuries-old trees or concealed in meticulously prepared positions, the German Scharfschütze reigned supreme. Armed with the superb Mauser Kar 98K rifle, often equipped with high-quality telescopic sights, he was a patient, deadly predator, capable of halting entire American platoons with a few well-aimed shots. American GIs learned to fear the unseen enemy, the single crack of a rifle that could come from anywhere, bringing instant death. The Americans had tanks, of course, the ubiquitous M4 Sherman. But in the claustrophobic confines of the bocage, the tanks were often just as vulnerable as the infantry. Their size made them obvious targets. Their noisy engines announced their approach from miles away, and the thick hedgerows channeled their movement into predictable paths. Perfect ambush points for German anti-tank teams armed with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks. To survive, the Shermans needed to become invisible, to blend into the very landscape that gave the German sniper his advantage. Standard American camouflage doctrine, however, was proving woefully inadequate. It primarily relied on factory-applied paint schemes, typically olive drab, sometimes with disruptive patterns. While effective in open country or desert environments, these flat paint jobs did little to break up the tank's massive, geometric silhouette against the complex three-dimensional backdrop of the Normandy hedgerows. A Sherman, even one painted green, still looked unmistakably like a tank when viewed through the telescopic sight of a German sniper patiently scanning the tree line. It cast unnatural shadows, its sharp angles contrasted with the organic shapes of the foliage, and its metallic surface reflected light in ways that vegetation did not. German camouflage techniques, by contrast, were often more sophisticated, involving intricate multicolored patterns designed to mimic specific foliage types, supplemented by the crews adding actual branches and leaves to their vehicles. But even this level of artistry was often insufficient against determined Allied air reconnaissance or experienced ground observers. What was needed was something more fundamental, a way to completely disrupt the tank's form, to make it disappear not just visually, but structurally into the surrounding environment. The official solution from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department was slow in coming. Engineers experimented with new paint patterns, specialized netting materials, and even dummy structures. But these solutions were often complex, expensive, or difficult to apply and maintain in the field. The real breakthrough, like so many wartime innovations, emerged from the bottom up, from the pragmatic ingenuity of the soldiers and mechanics facing the problem directly. They looked at the German sniper, hidden perfectly within the leaves, and asked a simple question. How could they make a 30-ton tank disappear in the same way? The answer wasn't a new paint formula or a complex electronic cloaking device. It was something far simpler, cheaper, and readily available: the standard issue camouflage net. This wasn't the fine, precisely patterned netting used for sniper veils. This was a large, coarse mesh net, often resembling a giant fishing net, designed primarily to be draped over artillery pieces or supply dumps. It was considered a crude, basic piece of equipment, but American crews began to realize its hidden potential. By draping these large nets loosely over their Shermans, they achieved something simple paint could not. They broke the silhouette. The net created irregular, sagging shapes that distorted the tank's sharp angles. It cast complex, shifting shadows that mimicked the play of light through leaves, and crucially, it provided a perfect framework for attaching natural foliage. This was the key. The net itself wasn't the camouflage. It was the scaffolding upon which true invisibility could be built. The simple fishing net, combined with the readily available leaves and branches of Normandy, was about to become the Sherman's unexpected cloak of invisibility, frustrating German snipers and fundamentally changing the dynamics of the bocage battlefield. The transformation of a Sherman tank from a conspicuous steel target into a nearly invisible part of the landscape was an art form born of necessity, practiced daily by American tank crews and maintenance personnel. It wasn't a factory process. It was a constant, adaptive effort conducted in muddy fields and under dripping trees, often just miles from the front line. The key was the M1942 camouflage net, a large rectangular mesh, typically woven from coarse hemp or synthetic fibers, treated for durability and dyed in drab earth tones. Crucially, these nets were designed with irregular patterns of garnish, small strips of burlap or dyed canvas tied into the mesh to create a textured three-dimensional effect even before natural foliage was added. The process began by draping one or more of these massive nets over the entire tank, hull, turret, even the gun barrel. The goal was not a tight, form-fitting cover, but a loose, sagging drape that completely obscured the tank's hard geometric lines. The net hung like a thick shroud, breaking up the telltale silhouette of the turret, the sharp angle of the glacis plate, and the long, straight line of the main gun. This initial layer already significantly reduced the tank's visual signature, especially when viewed from a distance or through imperfect optics. But the real magic happened next. The crews understood that the net alone wasn't enough. It needed to be integrated with the immediate environment. Using the coarse mesh of the net as a framework, soldiers began aggressively weaving in local vegetation. This wasn't a delicate floral arrangement. It was a brutal, practical application of whatever was at hand. Branches torn from hedgerows, clumps of tall grass ripped from the fields, handfuls of leaves, even vines. Anything that matched the surrounding colors and textures was stuffed into the netting. Experienced crews developed sophisticated techniques. They learned to match the type of foliage to the specific terrain they expected to operate in. Oak branches for woodlands, straw and grass for open fields. They learned to arrange the foliage irregularly, avoiding neat patterns that might betray the underlying structure. They even learned to use mud, smearing it onto the net in the exposed parts of the tank to dull reflections and further blend the vehicle into the muddy landscape of Normandy. The tank ceased to be a machine and began to resemble a mobile bush, a rolling piece of the hedgerow itself. This process was continuous. The natural foliage would wilt and die within hours or days, losing its color and effectiveness. Crews had to constantly refresh the camouflage, stripping off the dead branches and weaving in fresh material before every mission, or even during lulls in combat. Camouflaging the tank became as routine a part of daily maintenance as checking the oil or cleaning the gun barrel. It was a constant, labor-intensive chore, but one that crews quickly learned was essential for survival. Contrast this adaptive, field-driven approach with the German camouflage doctrine. While German crews certainly supplemented their factory paint jobs with foliage, their system was often more rigid. Factory patterns, while sophisticated, were standardized and might not perfectly match the specific local environment. Furthermore, the German emphasis on maintaining the mechanical integrity and accessibility of their complex tanks sometimes discouraged the kind of all-encompassing foliage application practiced by the Americans. Draping thick branches over delicate engine intake grills or complex optical sights was often frowned upon in the more hierarchical German system. The American netting system, however, was designed around this need for integration. The coarse mesh allowed air circulation to the engine. Vision ports could be kept relatively clear, and the gun could still traverse and elevate, albeit sometimes with branches brushing against the hull. It was a messy, imperfect system, but it prioritized maximum concealment while maintaining basic operational capability. The effectiveness of this green ghost approach quickly became apparent. German snipers and anti-tank gunners, trained to look for the distinctive shape of a Sherman, found their targets dissolving into the background. Spotting reports became less certain. What looked like a dense bush through a telescopic sight might suddenly reveal itself as the turret of an M4, traversing its gun. The critical seconds needed to acquire a clear target picture were extended, often giving the Sherman crew just enough time to spot the threat and return fire. The simple fishing net, combined with the readily available foliage of the French countryside, was creating a level of tactical invisibility that sophisticated paint schemes alone could never achieve. For the German sniper, the Scharfschütze, the Normandy bocage should have been a perfect killing ground. His training emphasized patience, observation, and the precise application of firepower against high-value targets. Allied officers, radio operators, machine gunners, and, critically, tank commanders peering from their hatches were all prime targets. His primary tool was his telescopic sight, a marvel of German optical engineering capable of bringing distant targets into sharp focus, allowing him to identify vulnerabilities and place his shot with lethal accuracy. But the sudden proliferation of heavily camouflaged American tanks created a frustrating and often deadly dilemma for these expert marksmen. The problem wasn't just that the tanks were harder to see, it was that they were harder to identify and target effectively. The camouflage netting, laden with thick foliage, didn't just break up the silhouette, it actively obscured the critical aiming points that snipers relied on. Vision slits, commanders' cupolas, engine grills, even the main gun mantlet, all were often partially or completely hidden beneath layers of netting and branches. What the sniper saw through his scope was no longer a clearly defined steel machine with predictable weak points, but an amorphous, shifting mass of green and brown. This forced the German sniper into a dangerous guessing game. Was that dark shadow the commander's hatch, or just a gap in the foliage? Was that slight metallic glint the edge of a vision port, or merely sunlight reflecting off a wet leaf? Firing at an indistinct shape wasted precious ammunition and, more importantly, instantly revealed the sniper's own hidden position to the tank's machine gunners or supporting infantry. A missed shot against a tank often resulted in the sniper's death. Patience was paramount, but the American camouflage actively denied the sniper the clear target picture his doctrine demanded. Furthermore, the effectiveness of anti-tank rifles, like the Panzerbuchse, though increasingly obsolete by 1944, or specialized armor-piercing rounds fired from standard rifles, depended heavily on hitting specific, vulnerable areas. The thick layer of netting and foliage could sometimes prematurely detonate smaller shape-charged rifle grenades or deflect bullets aimed at vision slits or periscopes. While not providing true armor, the camouflage acted as a form of standoff disruption, interfering with the precise targeting required by less powerful anti-tank weapons. German after-action reports and captured sniper manuals began to reflect this frustration. Accounts emerged of snipers spending hours observing a suspected American tank position, unable to confirm its exact location or identify a viable target point through the dense camouflage. Spotters struggled to differentiate between genuinely concealed tanks and simple piles of brush or abandoned equipment draped with netting as decoys, a tactic the Americans quickly learned to employ. The psychological effect was significant. The sniper's confidence in his ability to dominate the battlefield through stealth and precision was eroded by an enemy who seemed capable of making 30-ton tanks vanish into thin air. This difficulty extended beyond snipers to include crews operating anti-tank guns, like the formidable PaK-40. While these guns could easily destroy a Sherman if they hit it, acquiring the target was the first and often hardest step. The gunner needed to see the tank clearly to lay his sights accurately. The American camouflage forced delays, created uncertainty, and increased the chances that the Sherman crew would spot the anti-tank gun's position before it could fire effectively. Every extra second the German gunner spent trying to distinguish the tank from the surrounding hedgerow was a second the Sherman could use to traverse its turret and return fire. The success of this simple camouflage technique highlights a fundamental principle often overlooked in technological arms races. Detection is the prerequisite for destruction. The most powerful gun is useless if it cannot find its target. The Americans, by mastering the crude art of foliage-laden netting, weren't making their tanks invulnerable, but they were significantly reducing their detectability and targetability. They were winning the crucial first few seconds of the engagement by simply disappearing. The German sniper, the master of concealment, was being defeated by an enemy who had learned to apply the same principles to machines the size of a small house, using nothing more than cheap netting and handfuls of leaves. For the American tank crews fighting their way through the deadly labyrinth of the Norman bocage and the forest beyond, the camouflage net quickly evolved from a cumbersome piece of issued equipment into an essential tool for survival, embraced with the pragmatic enthusiasm born of life-or-death necessity. While ordnance officers back in England might debate the precise aerodynamic effects or the optimal pattern density, the tankers on the ground knew one simple truth: tanks hidden under nets lived longer. This belief fueled a widespread, almost obsessive dedication to the art of camouflage among Sherman crews. Learning to effectively camouflage a 30-ton tank became a critical skill, passed down from veteran crews to replacements. It wasn't just about throwing a net over the top. It was about understanding the environment and thinking like the enemy. Crews learned to study the local vegetation, noting the dominant colors and types of foliage. They learned to avoid using greenery that would wilt too quickly or contrast unnaturally with the surroundings. They discovered the value of breaking up not just the silhouette, but also the shadows cast by the tank, using branches and nets to create a dappled, irregular pattern that blended with the forest floor or hedgerow base. They developed specific techniques for different parts of the vehicle. The long gun barrel, perhaps the most recognizable feature, was often wrapped heavily or had branches tied directly to it, distorting its linear shape. The turret, with its distinctive curved surfaces, required careful draping to eliminate highlights and break up its symmetrical form. Engine decks, needing airflow, were covered more loosely or used nets with wider mesh. Tracks and road wheels were often deliberately caked with mud to match the surrounding ground. The goal was total integration, transforming the machine into an indistinct lump of foliage and shadow. This dedication went beyond mere static concealment. Crews learned to camouflage their tanks quickly upon halting, even during brief pauses in an advance. A well-drilled crew could deploy their nets and begin adding local foliage within minutes of stopping, minimizing the time they presented a clear target. They also learned the importance of camouflaging their tracks, the telltale sign of recent vehicle movement. After positioning the tank, crew members would often use branches or shovels to roughen up or disguise the tracks leading into their hide position, further confusing enemy observers. The camouflage net also fostered new tactical approaches. Sherman commanders began using heavily camouflaged tanks as bait in elaborate ambushes. One tank, deliberately made slightly more visible or positioned in an obvious overwatch location, would draw German fire, revealing the enemy's position. Meanwhile, other Shermans, perfectly concealed under nets and foliage nearby, would use the distraction to maneuver for flanking shots. The effectiveness of the camouflage turned the tables, allowing the Americans to utilize the same principles of stealth and ambush that the Germans had previously mastered. Furthermore, the netting provided a marginal but sometimes useful degree of protection against certain types of threats. While useless against direct hits from anti-tank guns, the thick layer of netting and branches could sometimes prematurely detonate Panzerfaust heat rounds, causing the shaped charge jet to dissipate partially before hitting the main armor. It could also help deflect grenades or Molotov cocktails thrown by infantry at close range. These were secondary benefits. But in the brutal calculus of survival, every small advantage mattered. The psychological effect on the American crews was equally important. While driving a Sherman often felt like being inside a highly visible target, the act of applying camouflage provided a small measure of control, a tangible way to fight back against the unseen threats lurking in the landscape. The process of weaving branches into the net, of physically blending their machine into the earth, fostered a sense of proactive defense, boosting morale in the face of constant danger. The crews knew their camouflage wasn't perfect, but it was something, a shield, however flimsy, against the sniper's scope and the anti-tank gunner's sights. This widespread, almost instinctive adoption of aggressive camouflage by American units stood in contrast to practices in some other Allied armies, and even differed from the more formal German approach. It reflected a particularly American blend of pragmatism, improvisation, and a willingness to embrace simple, effective solutions, regardless of official doctrine. The fishing net, initially just another item on the equipment list, became a vital, crew-driven component of American armored tactics, proving that sometimes the best defense wasn't thicker armor, but simply the art of disappearing. The success of camouflage netting wasn't just a tactical quirk adopted by a few clever crews. It rapidly became a systematized, industrially supported component of the American war effort. Recognizing the profound impact this simple tool was having on vehicle survivability, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps and Ordnance Department moved quickly to mass-produce and distribute camouflage nets on an unprecedented scale. This transition from field improvisation to industrial standardization further amplified the advantage, creating a logistical reality that German industry, focused on complex paint chemistry and precise application, could not hope to match. The M1942 camouflage net itself was a product designed for mass production. Unlike sophisticated German paint schemes, which required specific chemical formulations, spray equipment, and controlled factory environments, the nets were essentially textiles. They could be manufactured by existing textile mills across the United States, companies that normally produced fishing nets, cargo nets, or even fabrics for clothing. The materials, hemp, jute, cotton, and later synthetic fibers, were relatively abundant. The weaving process was straightforward. The addition of the burlap garnish strips, while somewhat labor-intensive, could be done by semi-skilled workers. This meant production could be rapidly scaled up without diverting critical resources from aircraft or tank manufacturing. Millions of square yards of camouflage netting flowed across the Atlantic, becoming a standard issue item for virtually every type of American vehicle, not just tanks. Artillery pieces, trucks, command cars, even supply dumps were routinely draped in netting and supplemented with local foliage. This ubiquitous application created a noisy visual environment for German reconnaissance and observers. Spotting any Allied vehicle became more difficult, forcing German forces to expend more time and resources on reconnaissance, slowing their reaction times and increasing the chances of Allied units achieving tactical surprise. Furthermore, the American system was inherently flexible and modular. Nets came in the standard sizes, but could be easily cut, joined, or layered to cover vehicles of different shapes and sizes or to create larger concealed areas. Specialized nets were developed for specific purposes, such as snow camouflage, white garnish, for winter operations like the Battle of the Bulge, or sand-colored nets for desert environments, though less critical by 1944. This adaptability stood in contrast to the relative inflexibility of factory-applied paint schemes, which could be highly effective in one environment but dangerously conspicuous in another. A German tank painted for the forests of France would stand out starkly in the snows of the Ardennes unless laboriously repainted in the field, a task often impossible under combat conditions. An American crew simply needed to acquire the appropriate white garnish or supplement their existing net with snow-dusted branches. The Germans, while masters of individual vehicle camouflage paint, struggled to replicate the scale of the American netting effort. Their own textile industry was strained, and the logistical challenges of distributing bulky nets across multiple fronts were significant. While German units certainly used netting and foliage, it never achieved the near-universal, systematically supplied status it held in the U.S. Army. They remained more reliant on the artistry of paint, a solution that proved less adaptable and ultimately less effective against the sheer volume of crudely but effectively concealed American hardware. This difference wasn't just about aesthetics, it impacted operational doctrine. The American confidence in their ability to quickly conceal vehicles encouraged more aggressive maneuvering and bolder tactical positioning. Commanders knew they could halt their tanks or artillery in relatively exposed locations and achieve reasonable concealment within minutes using nets and foliage. German commanders, lacking this reliable, rapid concealment method, were often forced into more conservative tactics, relying on permanent terrain features or painstakingly prepared static positions. The simple net fostered a more fluid and opportunistic style of warfare. The industrialization of invisibility, powered by simple textile manufacturing and pragmatic field application, became another quiet, unglamorous pillar of Allied logistical superiority. While German engineers focused on the complex chemistry of paint pigments and light diffusion, American industry simply churned out millions of yards of cheap, effective netting. It was a victory of mass-produced texture over precisely engineered color, proving once again that in a war of attrition, the simplest, most scalable solution often provides the most decisive advantage. The widespread and effective use of camouflage netting by American forces created a cumulative effect that went far beyond frustrating individual German snipers or anti-tank gunners. It introduced a systemic, visual fog of war that degraded the overall effectiveness of German observation, reconnaissance, and fire control across the entire Western Front. This wasn't just about hiding tanks. It was about making the entire American presence harder to quantify, locate, and target, leading to critical miscalculations and delayed reactions by the German command. German reconnaissance, whether aerial or ground-based, relied heavily on identifying the distinctive shapes and thermal signatures of enemy equipment. The ubiquitous netting, especially when combined with natural foliage, fundamentally disrupted this process. Aerial photographs that should have clearly shown concentrations of American armor instead revealed ambiguous patterns of green and brown, making it difficult to distinguish between real tanks, empty vehicles, decoys, or simply dense vegetation. This uncertainty forced German intelligence analysts to spend more time scrutinizing images, often leading to outdated or inaccurate assessments of Allied strength and disposition. An armored thrust that might have been detected early and countered effectively could now gain critical hours of surprise simply because its components were visually ambiguous from the air. On the ground, the problem was even more acute. Forward observers attempting to call in German artillery fire struggled to provide accurate target locations. A report of tanks assembling near the woods became far less reliable when those tanks could easily be mistaken for natural features until they began to move and fire. This increased the risk of German artillery hitting empty ground, or worse, being hesitant to fire at all for fear of wasting precious ammunition on phantom targets. The camouflage netting effectively increased the search time required for German gunners to acquire and confirm a target, directly reducing their rate of effective fire. This cumulative blindness had a particularly devastating impact on German counter-battery fire. American artillery batteries, often comprising large numbers of M7 Priest self-propelled guns or towed M2 howitzers, were primary targets for German artillery. By diligently applying camouflage netting and local foliage to their guns, prime movers, and ammunition stacks, American artillery units significantly reduced their vulnerability to detection. German spotters, scanning for the telltale shapes of gun barrels or the regular outlines of vehicle parks, often overlooked well-camouflaged American positions. This allowed U.S. artillery to operate with greater impunity, delivering sustained, devastating barrages that supported infantry advances and suppressed German defenses. The simple net provided a crucial layer of protection for the king of battle. Furthermore, the effectiveness of the American camouflage directly contributed to the erosion of German morale. Infantrymen and panzer crews, already facing overwhelming Allied material superiority, were now confronted with an enemy who seemed capable of appearing out of nowhere. The constant anxiety of not knowing whether that dense thicket concealed a Sherman 75mm gun or just harmless bushes wore down nerves and fostered a sense of helplessness. Every hedgerow, every patch of woods became a potential source of lethal surprise. This psychological pressure, compounded over weeks and months of continuous combat, significantly degraded the fighting spirit of German units. German attempts to adapt were often too little, too late. While they certainly employed camouflage, their system lacked the scale, standardization, and ingrained crew-level discipline of the American approach. German netting was often scarcer, foliage application less consistent, and the underlying philosophy remained more focused on sophisticated paint schemes. They were fighting an enemy that had weaponized the landscape itself, using simple, universally available materials to create a tactical advantage that complex German engineering could not easily counter. The effectiveness of the fishing nets demonstrated that battlefield dominance wasn't just about firepower or armor thickness. It was also about controlling visibility and information. The Americans, through sheer industrial capacity and pragmatic application of simple concealment techniques, were winning the battle for visual control, one foliage-draped Sherman at a time. The ultimate legacy of the simple camouflage net in World War II lies not in its technological sophistication, but in its profound demonstration of how adaptive, low-tech solutions applied on a massive industrial scale can overcome sophisticated, high-tech doctrine. The German military machine, with its superb optics, meticulously trained snipers, and complex camouflage paint theories, was consistently confounded by an enemy who simply learned to cover their machines with fishing nets and local foliage. The German engineering philosophy prioritized inherent vehicle characteristics, perfect paint schemes designed in factories, armor angled for optimal ballistic performance. They sought to create the perfect fighting machine. The American approach, driven by battlefield pragmatism and enabled by industrial might, focused on adaptable systems that empowered the user. The camouflage net was the ultimate expression of this. It wasn't part of the tank's design, but a simple modular addition that allowed the crew to tailor the vehicle's appearance to any environment instantly. It turned every soldier into a camouflage expert, leveraging local resources instead of relying on factory-dictated patterns. Post-war analyses often focus on the Sherman's mechanical reliability or the sheer numbers produced, but the impact of effective concealment, enabled by the simple net, was a crucial force multiplier. By reducing detection ranges, increasing target acquisition times for the enemy, and enabling tactical surprise, the netting system directly contributed to higher survival rates for American armor and infantry and faster operational tempos. It was a cheap, almost invisible investment that paid enormous dividends in combat effectiveness. German technical assessments after the war acknowledged the surprising effectiveness of Allied camouflage discipline, but often framed it as a brute force measure compensating for inferior vehicle design. They failed to fully grasp the philosophical shift it represented, a move away from designing the perfect, static camouflage towards creating a system for dynamic, adaptive concealment. The American net wasn't just hiding a tank, it was hiding it intelligently, using the environment itself as the primary camouflage material. This story serves as a powerful reminder that victory in warfare is not always determined by the most advanced weapon system. Often it is the simple, overlooked details, the logistical chains, the maintenance procedures, the training doctrines, and, in this case, the methods of concealment that create the decisive edge. The German sniper, peering through his state-of-the-art telescopic sight, was defeated not by superior American optics, but by a soldier's understanding of how to weave branches into a cheap piece of netting. The final verdict is woven into the very fabric of battlefield survival. The ability to disappear is often more valuable than the ability to withstand a direct hit. The American camouflage net, crude and simple though it was, provided that ability on a scale the German military could neither replicate nor consistently defeat. It proved that sometimes the most effective way to win a fight is to ensure the enemy never clearly sees who or what they are fighting. The fishing net didn't just hide tanks, it hid the true scale and speed of the American industrial war machine, allowing it to deliver the killing blow from an unexpected, unseen quarter.